Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm coordinator for the Coastal Marine Ecosystem-Based Management Tools Network, the EBM Tools Network for short. The network is co-coordinated by OCTO and NatureServe, and we're very pleased to be hosting this webinar today and be talking about cumulative impact tools for marine spatial planning. Before we get started with the webinar, I wanted to let everyone know that at the end of formal presentations, we are going to have time for questions. And we very much encourage you to send in questions. There's two ways you can do this. You can type, well, three ways really. You can type them into the chat panel and send them to us. You can type them into the Q&A panel. The things sent into the chat, you can just send it to panelists, in which case not everyone will be able to see it, or you could make it visible to other attendees. Or anything sent to the Q&A panel, however, will be private just to the panelists. And the third way that you could ask questions is there's a little virtual hand icon in your user interface. If you raise that, your hand will go up and we can unmute you for you to ask your question directly to the presenters and the panelists. So again, we highly encourage questions. Send them in whenever they occur to you. And if you have something in response to something that's been said in the presentation, please keep it professional. Feel free to send it to everyone through the chat panel. You can send it to other attendees, but please keep it to the topic and professional. Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're so pleased to be talking about the cumulative impact tools today. And I just wanted to introduce Claire Waldman from the European MSP platform to get things started. Okay, Claire.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm just going to switch to my screen. Okay, so welcome. I am going to start out with providing some introductory information to this webinar about the European MSP platform and our work, as well as give some context for this topic of cumulative impact tools, which we will be hearing more about today. So first, I'd like to share what exactly is the European MSP platform, since I know we have a very diverse group in the audience today. We are a technical assistance mechanism which provides services to European member states and to the European Commission to implement the EU MSP directive. And this directive states that all coastal EU member states are required to prepare cross-sectoral maritime spatial plans by 2021. I would also like to provide a small disclaimer that I am not an EU employee, and therefore I would like to clearly state that none of the information shared today represents the European Commission's official opinion. So with that out of the way, I'll talk a little bit more about the services that the European MSP platform provides. We are composed of a team of dedicated experts who provide advice and knowledge on MSP-specific topics. We also host a website with diverse resources available on maritime spatial planning. We also provide a question and answer service for our experts to react within a short period of time to specific questions on various topics. And we also develop technical studies to fill knowledge gaps that have been identified throughout Europe. For example, there is a study which the MSP platform developed and was published recently by the European Commission on MSP for Blue Growth. And additionally, we also organize different types of events to support knowledge exchange on MSP, including workshops and conferences. I'll share a little bit about how the MSP platform is organized. Our team is distributed throughout Europe, and we have focal points in each European sea basin, as displayed here on this slide. And we also have a central office in Berlin and in Brussels. This slide is just giving a glimpse of our homepage and describes a little bit about what you can find there. We have an extensive collection of practical experiences related to conducting MSP, including several examples of cumulative impact tools. We also provide overviews of MSP to date in EU countries, as well as cooperation on MSP at the sea basin level. And we promote events, funding opportunities, and share the latest news on MSP in Europe. We, of course, also share documentation from the events that the MSP platform organizes. And if you would like to stay up to date on our activities, you can subscribe to our newsletter from our website, or you can also follow us on Twitter. So moving now specifically to today's topic, this webinar actually is a follow-up from an expert roundtable, which we organized earlier this year. The topic of cumulative impact tools was indicated to be of interest to EU member states, especially because these tools can help incorporate the ecosystem-based approach into marine management. And this incorporation is called for in several policy frameworks, including the MSP directive and other European policy directives. And as we will hear from our presenters today, cumulative impact tools can be very useful for evaluating the environmental effects resulting from human activities in a given area. We wanted to organize this roundtable and this subsequent webinar to provide an opportunity for exchange on experiences developing cumulative impact tools and approaches specifically for MSP. And similarly, the accompanying strategic environmental assessments that are developed alongside maritime spatial planning processes. The discussions that were held at this roundtable focused on ways to advance tools further and further integrate them into MSP and SEA processes. And I will share a little bit more about the outcomes of the roundtable discussions at the end of the webinar following the presentation. I also wanted to mention that we featured at the roundtable many efforts underway in Europe to develop cumulative impact tools and approaches. These were mainly from various projects that were completed or are ongoing in Europe. And as you can see from this list, this was a very popular topic. This list is not comprehensive of all of the cumulative impact tools and approaches that are ongoing in Europe currently. For example, there is a cumulative effects assessment workstream for the OSPAR Regional Sea Convention for the Northeast Atlantic that is not listed here, and many others. I would like to say that the presentations of the tools listed on this slide are available on the MSP platform website, along with a full summary report from the roundtable. And today we are going to hear from two of these roundtable presenters specifically on the webinar, highlighted in bold. So with that, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our presenters. We'll have a presentation first from Maria da Luz Fernandes and Adriano Cantella from the University of Aveiro in Portugal on their cumulative impact methodology and its importance for MSP and strategic environmental assessments. And then we will have a second presentation by Marina Markovic from the UNEP MAP Priority Actions Program Regional Activity Center, or PAPRAC for short, who will describe work that she is undertaken in Montenegro. So with that, I will now turn it over to Maria Deluche for her presentation.
Hello everyone. I would like to welcome all the participants. We are going to present a Portuguese case study together with Adriano. So this work was developed as part of the PhD project I'm doing, and a paper emerged from this study back in 2017. As we know, human activities and uses cause multiple pressures on ecosystems, and these pressures may produce multiple adverse effects, or as you can call it, impacts. These may have various degrees depending on the species and the habitats they impact, and they can act cumulatively. We gathered information from 21 activities and uses, we call it drivers, to which we classify the type of pressure they provoke in accordance with MESFP, and we measured their intensity using existing available metrics as indicators. Ecosystems were obtained from Habitats Directive and the Mesh Atlantic project, and our study area was the Portuguese mainland subdivision. This area was subject of an MESP exercise in 2010 by the Portuguese government. Since then, new legislation was published, and an MESP plan, call it now situation plan, was developed, and this is just now in a few days entering public consultation. But back to our study area, we divided it into grid cells with 25 square kilometers of area. For each cell, we used the approach of Alpern. But first, to prepare the data, we log transformed and rescaled the information to put it in a single scale. Then each driver was multiplied by the presence or absence of the ecosystems, and then by an appropriate weighing variable. This was extracted from a paper from Alpern also, which is the approach I was following. This paper was on ecosystem vulnerability to anthropogenic threats. And here, this vulnerability was measured by the spatial scale, frequency, and functional impact of each threat in the ecosystems. So we had to adopt our ecosystems and activities in the denominations to fit Alpern's work. In the end, we end up with using all our activities and uses and 8 of our ecosystems. Afterwards, we overlapped our cumulative impact scores with the MESP exercise that we had. This MESP exercise presented a specialization of the existing activities, the potential activities, and an MESP proposal. Results presented a map with index scores, where we could see that coastal areas were suffering high impacts, and these were diminishing as we would go further offshore. Of course, we only had the scores in locations where we had both activities and ecosystems present, and we had several activities and occurring simultaneously, especially among coastal habitats. Higher percentages were observed between 7 to 9 simultaneous activities, and in ecosystems, in marine ecosystems, the number of simultaneous activities was, of course, much smaller. We divided the activities and uses into main themes, and we noticed that fisheries showed the highest average scores and impacted space, followed by a theme that we call it land input, which meant all the activities related with land discharges, water quality, dredging, marine litter, and so on. Higher values were obtained in the north stretches from Viana do Castelo to Figueira da Foz, in the center region between Peniche and Setúbal, and in the south coast in Lagos to Faro. When we overlapped with the MESP proposal, we noticed that several potential activities could still occur in locations that were already facing high impacts. This means the areas for general uses we can see in the image. Also, locations with high conservation interests were showing high cumulative impact scores.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more. My name is Adriano, by the way. I will talk a little bit about the work that is being in development right now, and to fill the gap that Maria de Luz mentioned before on the lack of knowledge for certain habitats. We developed an index of pressure where we excluded all the biological and ecological information, and we summed the scores of the activities and uses and call it a pressure index. This way, we were able to map where these pressures occur in the study area. Basically, it is a weighted index of different activities that occur simultaneously and also uses. This shows that the distribution of anthropogenic pressures are more homogeneous in the study area. It's useful for locations with a lack of data regarding ecosystems, and despite this, the results are consistent with the cumulative impact model that we proposed before, and these areas are more impacted also near the coast. In terms of the importance for MSP from these approaches, it's important to highlight that these tools are able to inform the patterns of conflicts between the impacts from anthropogenic activities and also the important areas for conservation. This approach is pragmatic and simple and easy to understand by planners and stakeholders, which we think that it's important in order to communicate decisions and possibilities. It also provides inputs on ecosystem conditions and carrying capacity, as well as thresholds for ecosystems. It informs where reductions in anthropogenic pressures should be an explicit goal, and also they are also possible. It showed to be a flexible tool that can be used for managing and also for monitoring the measures already in place. It supports the prospective planning interventions within the approach of ecosystem-based management, and can also serve as a data catalog where we can gather information of activities, uses, and ecological and biological data. The challenges that we face right now regarding these tools is that they to be more effective, they need it's needed to analyze the conflict and compatibilities and also environmental assessment tools and where they should be improved. The information on cumulative impact, such as cumulative impact model maps, provided are useful to support decisions and also identifying those ecosystems that are most impacted overall. These tools can also inform where reduction in anthropogenic pressures should and can be an explicit goal, and it's shown to be a flexible tool that can be used for managing and monitoring the measures already in place. The cumulative impacts from direct and indirect human pressures on marine and coastal ecosystems are potentially important to provide inputs to several coastal marine policies and commitments. It is shown in this slide. In terms of environmental quality, cumulative impacts can be a big asset to give information to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, as well as the Water Framework Directive. In terms of spatial planning, it can inform and help to develop the Marine Spatial Planning Directive and also Integrated Coastal Management Recommendation. In terms of the environmental assessment, it can give value information for the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive and Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive, providing insights on specific management and all activities where it's provided less impacts. It's also important in terms of the commitment of Blue Growth Initiative and also the Atlantic Action Plan. In terms of nature conservation, it can help us to go into the right direction in terms of the European 2020 biodiversity strategy, and also for the Convention for Biodiversity, Convention of Biodiversity. And tools and methods help in an integrated way for a sound ocean management. This is especially important for Portugal, as Portugal is the jurisdiction over one of the largest European economic exclusive zones in Europe, with a claim of the continental shelf extinction over 200 nautical miles endorsed by United Nations. Portugal maritime jurisdiction will be 40 times larger than its continental footprint. As such, Portugal needs to devise innovative and more efficient knowledge-based actions, such as cumulative impact models, to the use of its ocean space. This map gives us an idea of the area that Portugal faces in terms of management of the sea, and that's all. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria Deluche and Adriano. I see that there are some questions that have come in. I think that we will take those questions at the end of the webinar. For now, we will pass the microphone, so to speak, to Marina Markovic from UNEP MEP Paprak to share her work in Montenegro on cumulative impact assessments.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. I just need a few seconds, sorry. Okay, so hello again. Just to a few sentences from myself. So I come from, actually I represent the United Nations Environment Program Office, actually one of its regional activity centers. We are based, actually our focus of the work is the Mediterranean, and our key legal document is the Barcelona Convention, under which we operate. And the center I work with, which is a Priority Actions Program Regional Activity Center, or PAPRAC, is the center which deals with coastal management and now with marine spatial planning. So today I will give you just this little tool to present you a tool that we developed and tested in Montenegro. So this is a quick overview on what I would like to say. So I know that there are some of the, or many participants coming from non-European countries. So apologies for those who know, but I would just give a few sentences about Montenegro and a little bit about the legislative background, which is the, let's say, inspiration for this methodology. I will not go into many details of it. And of course, the methodological approach and how it was tested in Montenegro. So looking at the Mediterranean Sea, Montenegro is this small country marked in red. it's, if we zoom a little bit more, it's the country focus in the Adriatic, and actually opposite the Italy. So this is Montenegro. It's relatively a small country. It has a small coastline with 300 kilometers and marine surface of around 2,500 square kilometers, and this relates only to territorial sea and internal sea. These two, the two blue colors. According to the national law of the sea, EZ can be established. However, it needs to go through the parliament, and it's not yet proclaimed. So the pilot that we, let's say, tested is in this little bay of Boka Kotorska on the north part of Montenegrin coast. So looking again at the Mediterranean and the Europe, to give a context on legal framework, so one of the key documents is actually, of course, in addition to the EU MSP directive, is the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Here is the link for those who would like to know a little bit more about it. It's actually a joint effort of European countries towards, let's say, establishing a good environmental status of the European marine areas. So I mentioned in the beginning that I work for the center which operates in the whole Mediterranean. So this EU document actually is only applicable for the northern part of the Mediterranean, for the EU countries. Therefore, within the UNEP map system, we developed this let's say an additional or the same approach as EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, to have the same approach, but not only focused on the EU countries, but also to the non-EU countries, in order to actually have all the countries of the Mediterranean jointly working together towards the having the good environmental status of the sea. This approach, we call it the ecosystem approach, within which we develop this integrated monitoring and assessment program. So also these systems of either directive or this IMAP actually working through 11 ecological objectives or descriptors, and each of them is actually operated by a number of indicators. So this was our, let's say, a starting point, and the data we started with when developing our methodology. So by using these indicators and these objectives, the countries actually are obliged to assess the state, to set the targets on what this actually ideal environmental, good environmental status would be, to start implementing different measures to achieve it, and of course to monitor the progress towards achieving that. So to go back to the methodology, actually we had one main goal. So since all the countries of the Mediterranean are somehow obliged to follow this process, to collect different data and to undertake this monitoring, how about using the same data to actually use them for the future preparation of marine spatial plan? So in order to do that, we developed this methodological process composed of two steps. First, to use this data and to do the vulnerability assessment, to identify the areas that are the most vulnerable to some of the human activities, and then to use that information to produce the marine spatial plan. Development of this methodology and actually testing it in Montenegro was even funded by the Montenegrin government. And as mentioned before, we focused just on this tiny little bay where we knew we had a lot of data, and this is why we tested the methodology there. Methodology has four main steps: from collecting data, mapping it, evaluating, assessing vulnerability, and providing some recommendations for the plan. So when connecting this initial information, we had two types of them. First, which are actually focused on natural characteristics, which we call here a state. And then we added, or actually provided, a value to each of these elements of nature. At the same time, we also collected information on existing pressure in the environment. We also evaluated and made a combination of these two information in order to identify areas where the highest impacts are currently in the area. We also wanted to look forward on how the future activity or planned activity would affect the environment, taking into consideration the existing value of the nature, also the existing impacts, but also the capacity of the environment to adapt to some possible changes. And this led us to this so-called vulnerability, based on which we provided some recommendations to the plan. So, to be a little bit more practical, to show you how it looks like. So we actually, so this is the map showing the value of the habitats or the environment. So for each individual environmental component, we mapped it, and by using different criteria and actually expert opinion on this, we provided value on the scale of 1 to 5. These criteria involve like protection status, distribution of, let's say, habitat, the rareness, and so on. And the 5 would be the let's say the highest value. So in this map, the areas that are marked darker green are actually the areas that have a higher natural value. Similar approach was used also for the pressures. So we didn't start it from the activity, but from the measured pressure, like the level of eutrophication, the amount of contaminants in the sea, etc. Also built up area. So we actually valued the level of those pressures. We combined them with the values of the environment, and we identified areas that are, let's say, having the highest impact on the environment. So that the darker the area are the area where the impact is the highest. So these two images actually show what is the current situation. So what is the current value, and also what are the current impacts. But also we wanted to see how this environment would react to some of the future activities. Actually, we have been operating with 20 different activities. So for each component of the environment, like for example the habitat that you can see here, we wanted to see how some future each let's say of the activity, like recreational boating here, would like actually impact the environment in the future, or how the environment is vulnerable to this activity, taking into consideration the existing value, the existing impact, but also the extent of expected change and the capacity of this environment to adapt to some possible change. Again, the darker the area shows the area where for example, in this case, habitats are most vulnerable to specific activity. We also provided a cumulative presentation of for each component of the environment, like habitats here, to all the 20 activities that we assessed. So the darker the area show again the vulnerability of this component to most of the activities, to the largest number of the activities. And also this is the final, actually, the image, let's say, showing the integrated vulnerability of all environmental components and all the activities. The darkest areas are actually those where most of the activities should be either carefully planned or avoided totally. If we would give this kind of map to the spatial planners, it would be quite difficult for them to use it without additional explanation. So we provided explanations, let's say, in a sense of recommendations coming as a result of this kind of assessment to indicate where are the areas where some protection should be maybe established, or where some rehabilitation measures should take place, and so on. Of course, this is not the plan, but this is just the, let's say, environmental maximum or recommendations coming just from the environmental perspective. So if we would look at some overall MSP process, what we did is this. Actually, we just identified what are the conflicts between the environment and some sea uses. Or if we would look at this way, what we did is this part. Actually, we identify the areas that are very fragile or vulnerable to some of the activities, but also the areas that are not so vulnerable. However, in the planning process, this is not enough. What is absolutely needed is to identify the sea use suitability, meaning the suitability of each marine activity independent on natural values, on what areas would be most suitable for certain activity. Only by combining these two, we can think about different sea options. So the idea is to find locations that are most suitable for certain activity, but that at the same time are the least vulnerable from the environmental point of view. So in our methodology, we didn't go through the end. We didn't develop the plan, but we just tested the methodology on vulnerability assessment. And to see whether this is possible. Is it possible to use the indicators and the activities countries are going to do following the requirements of the EU directive and of the UNEP map? Can these information be useful or used for the future MSP? And the answer is yes. However, number of these indicators were not envisaged for MSP process, so we need to do some modifications, to add some, and so on. The process, as for this initial assessment, was a little bit complex. We had to work with a lot of experts and with the expert opinion. However, we are already using the opportunity of some of the EU projects and some of the partners that are partners also in those projects that develop a similar tools, how maybe we could join forces and develop something a little bit even more advanced to develop some software that could maybe make all this process even more simple in the future. And also, what is a great opportunity for us, we have a JEF-funded project that is just starting, where we plan, and this project is going to be implemented in Albania and Montenegro. So we would also like to extend this assessment to the entire Montenegrin marine area, and actually to produce an MSP by using this information as well. So this is all from my side. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Marina. And I am glad to hear about some opportunities for collaboration as well. I am going to now share some reflections on this topic that were discussed at the expert roundtable, where Adriano and Marina first shared their work. This roundtable, as I mentioned earlier on the webinar, included a discussion session on what are the common limitations for further tool development and integration, as well as opportunities for future use and development of the tools in MSP and strategic environmental assessment processes. So I'm just going to provide a brief summary of some of the main discussion points here. some of which have been mentioned by Adriano and Marina in their presentations as well. So first, starting with the limitations, some of the key conclusions included that I think as these presentations showed, cumulative impact assessment models can be very complex, and at times MSP planners themselves do not have the background knowledge to enable an in-depth understanding of these models and assessments, specifically how they function and the results that they produce. This complexity is also a challenge for tool developers. Thus, it makes sense to start off with simple functions in these models and assessments, and then step by step add complexity into a model or a tool. Another limitation discussed was data, specifically data availability and access is a common challenge across the cumulative impact tools, as well as geographical coverage, resolution, and consistent formatting of existing data. There are several initiatives underway in Europe to create centralized repositories of data, such as the EMODnet, and other work pursued in various MSP projects to try and overcome this limitation to a certain degree. Another limitation has to do with uncertainty. Cumulative impact tools need to factor in uncertainty regarding data inputs, and subsequently assessment results also need to be interpreted according to the degree of uncertainty indicated by the tool developers and the results. Another limitation has to do with temporal conditions. This is related to seasonality or anticipated future conditions or effects over time. And this is an area that some of the tools presented during the roundtable are seeking to improve on specifically. We also had a discussion about how interpreting the results of the cumulative impact assessments can be a challenge because these are often presented as a map-based output, which may not adequately capture the multidimensional nature of the assessment, and that the assessment results need to be interpreted by planners or even politicians according to criteria or guidelines. Another final limitation is the sustainability of existing development approaches. The majority of the tools presented at the roundtable were developed in a short-term project-based context, so a 3 to 5 year context, and only a few of them are part of longer-term initiatives or formally integrated into national MSP processes. This has resulted in a variety of tools and approaches being developed in isolation, and at times a limited use as part of statutory MSP processes, although I think the example that Adriano and Maria de Lush shared shows an example of a tool that is being developed as part of an official MSP process. Of course, we also shared key conclusions on opportunities for further integration and development of these tools for MSP. Of course, one key opportunity that these cumulative impact approaches provide is the application of an ecosystem-based approach in MSP, and that working with planners early in an MSP process on tool design can ensure that ecosystem effects are considered throughout the MSP process. Some of these tools can also help evaluate impacts of management measures and allow users to determine how resource availability may change as a result of an activity or a scenario at the national level as well as potentially at the sea basin scale. Another opportunity related to outputs based on objectives or criteria from a target group, and that close collaboration between cumulative impact tool developers and MSP planners can help ensure that outputs are customized to inform decisions related to clearly defined MSP objectives. Some of these tools can also be helpful for communication and awareness raising to MSP stakeholders about the ecosystem-based approach itself and help clarify conceptual definitions of impact, risks, and decision criteria. And these tools, as was shown today, can provide a link to other policy directives, such as the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which both our presenters described. In terms of how the tools are actually developed, several of these tools are open tools. They are web-based and ready for use, and some make their data and source codes available to others for further developments. As Marina touched upon towards the end of her presentation, there are opportunities for future collaborative work to compare and combine approaches, since several of these tools are based on the same underlying conceptual model, and their developers are also engaged in existing collaborations regarding data collection. And of course, there are future developments foreseen in terms of the features and technical functions of some of these tools, and that these can help address more specific MSP or strategic environmental assessment needs. And I would just like to say that there is more information about the limitations and opportunities discussion available in the summary report from the roundtable, which you can find on the MSP platform website or by following up with me directly. With that, I would like to say thank you for your attention, and I have shared on this slide the contact information for myself as well as the presenters. So you are welcome to follow up with us after the webinar. For now, I think that we will address some of the questions that have been coming in through the chat window and the question tool. So the first question that came in is for Maria Deluche and Adriano, and it has to do with more information on the weighting of values according to Halpern in their cumulative impact methodology. This question specifically is, does it consider the sensitivity of different ecosystems, and is it applicable for all EUC regions?
Yes, thank you, Claire. Yeah, the work of Halpern was published in 2007, and it convened a series of workshops, and it was developed for all over the world. And they weighed scores for ecosystems vulnerability to each threat. So there is a combination between a threat or activity and ecosystems, and they scaled it up by they measured it. Using information on the scale, the frequency, if it never occurs, if it's occasional, persistent, the magnitude of the impact, the resistance to the recovery time, or the certainty. So all of this was taken into account, and a vulnerability score was produced. It would we use this information, so it's applicable for all over the world. But of course, a limitation that we have noticed that it would be much better to have developed our own system or apply this method with participants in a workshop on the Portuguese scenario. It would be a much stronger case, but at the time we did it this way. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria. I have another question regarding your work specifically, which has to do with how the tool addresses thresholds and ecosystem carrying capacities, specifically in relation to the requirements under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive to achieve good environmental status.
Well, I will try to answer this question. This is a very pertinent, it's the $1 million question, because in fact, we don't have the doubt that the tool can give this information. However, for now, these values of thresholds and carrying capacity are not well established. So as soon as, and I think this is only be achievable through expert opinion information for specific places. And for now, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive don't give a precise threshold value that can give us an idea if these values are overcome or not. But as soon as this is achieved, our tool is able to assess if the thresholds have been passed or not. So this is our what we think about it. For now,
every day, yeah.
Now it's not possible to see if the thresholds are overcome because we don't have a precise carrying capacity value or threshold value.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. And there's another question that came in specifically related to the MSP context in Portugal. The question was if the study, I think your work, Maria and Adriano, was the study a baseline study to inform planners, or did it consider the outlined MSP plan when mapping pressures?
This study was developed already 2 years ago. So we used the information available from the MESP exercise poem that was developed in 2010. And they discriminated the existing activities which we used as information input. And at the time that we finished the study, the legislation was passed on the new MESP plan, situation plan now call it, and it was just at the same time, but it was a coincidence. So no, I don't think it was used.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. It sounds like, though, in the current planning process in Portugal that it will likely be used.
Hope so.
Okay. I'd like now then to take a few questions for Marina on her work in Montenegro. There was a question that came in specifically regarding the vulnerability assessment. The question is, which rules do you use to combine the vulnerability of two areas? Does 1 + 1 = 2, or do you also consider 1 + 1 = 3? I hope this question makes some sense to you.
Maybe. Okay, so it depends what they consider one, but okay. So we had these several steps. So so for each, let's say, different type of habitats, for example, we associated different value. So vulnerability on specific habitat or specific part of the environment is not always the same. So for example, some pressures are going to be different if we're talking about one habitat or the other. Again, what we also did is that some habitat in one area did not have, let's say, the same value as habitat in some other area. For example, if in other area it was quite, if we decided that it is more already threatened or rare or something like this. This was the case for Posidonia. So I guess this is what you meant.
Okay, I think.
Yeah, so the answer is I think if I understood well, we considered 1 + 1 = 3.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thanks.
Yeah.
And another question for you, Marina, regarding the development process. How long did the whole analysis take, including putting together the data layers and forming recommendations?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I would say too long. I mean, it lasted like a year, but the reason is because it's not like we first developed the full methodology and then we started testing it, but it was we were developing the methodology and testing it at the same time. So there was a lot of back and forth. So this is why it lasted, I would say, quite long. But normally this kind of assessment, once you have established the process, the approach, how you should evaluate different components, it should be relatively quickly, considering that you have data. Of course, that you don't have to spend a lot of time collecting data. But this is why for us this process is important, because following the MSFD or this IMAP ECAP process coming from UNEP-MAP, countries are obliged to collect or store the data that we want to use at the same time for MSP. So this is why we should reduce the amount of time that we spend for collecting data and information.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think we have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to ask one last question to you, Marina, and regarding your experience in Montenegro. Should valuations include better estimates of different ecosystem services rather than just expert opinion?
Yeah, okay, maybe I didn't use the good word. Okay, expert opinion is actually based on already existing information and estimates of let's say values or categories of different ecosystem components. So so basically this expert opinion is always based on available information. So it's not just like that. So maybe I didn't actually put it quite well.
Okay, I think that helps clarify a little bit more. And there's one question that just came in for all of our presenters, and I'll use this as the final wrap-up question. It is, did any one of you apply cost-benefit analysis or trade-offs in preparing the MSPs? Example of some activities being a country's priorities. Have any of you? Adriano, go ahead.
I can try to answer. I'm not sure if I understand correctly the question, but we made an exercise that it's under publication now, that was using the cumulative impacts as a cost layer for a software called Markson, that uses cumulative impacts as the costs to establish or to choose the areas of priority areas for conservation, and also assuming that some activities, in order to some priority areas for conservation should be placed, if possible, in areas with less impacts. So what we did was use the cumulative impact scores as a surrogate of costs.
Okay.
In the spatial the choice of some areas and priority areas.
Sounds very interesting. And I think perhaps some members of the audience will be interested in following up on that publication and work with you. Okay. I think with that then we can close the webinar. And from my side, on behalf of the EUMSP platform, I'd like to say thank you, especially to our presenters and to the participants today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for
the invitation, and it was a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you very much.
All right. We hope to see everyone on future webinars, and thank you so much for presenting today, everyone. Okay. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank